Yeah, not so bad. Not so bad. Always smiling. Always smiling.
Always smiling, yes. Yeah, damn good meds. Yeah.
Shh! Don't give away the secrets. Have you had a good week?
Yeah, it's not been a bad week. Yeah. I think today we've got the backside of it, Hurricane Bob or Ian
Is
or
this
Derek.
Ian?
Ian.
It's Ian, is it? I think. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Which is pretty naff name really for a hurricane.
It
No offense.
is, but I tell you what, he pissed all over the place this morning. This afternoon it was actually. I was in school and we just looked out the window and it was just like this wall. I was supposed to be leaving and going down to reception, and I thought, do you need anything cutting out? just to,
Yeah.
I'm not walking out in that. It's stair rods.
Yeah, it was really, really bad when I went to the gym this morning. About sort of like 5, I think it was. I drove on the promenade and it was just coming down in sheets. And yeah, I thought, what sort of idiots out at this time of the morning? And then I realised me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's one of those things you suddenly looked in the rearview mirror and thought, shit.
Yeah, I am. Pillock, yes.
Well, I would say, well, lovely. So it's been an interesting week. It's been a fun week so far, but part of this week has been reading. So, Ash, what have we been reading this week?
This week we have been reading. Oh, fuck yeah, I meant to do a synopsis on this.
Supposed to, but I'm sure you can get one out of the top of your head. You can do one of my synopsises.
We have been reading Was It an Illusion? The Parsons, was it story or tale?
Parson's story, I think.
Yeah, Parsons story. By Amelia
Abigail.
Amelia Abigail.
I think it was Abigail, wasn't it? Hang on, I've got it written down there. Oh, no, you're right. It was Amelia D. Edmonds.
Good old Amelia, yeah. And yeah, this is a story about a Parson who's a school inspector. Well, part of his duties are that he's meant to be a school inspector. He gets moved. He's a successful school inspector. He gets moved to a different area. As he's going around, he's sent to this one remote area. And as he's walking there, he encounters a spooky man who just walks past him in the mist, and doesn't say anything to him, even though the parson is sort of like saying, am I going the right way to Little Bottom or whatever it's called? Is it something pit?
It is, yeah. Bottomless pit or something like that.
Yeah, so he sort of like says, am I going the right way? And this bloke blanks him completely. Parson turns around, the bloke's disappeared. Sorry, bloke with a limp has limped past him. Parson turns around, and bloke with the limp has disappeared. But further in the distance, I mean, you've got Dead Tom Sawyer as your name at the moment. And yeah, we've got Dead Tom Sawyer wandering along with his rod over his shoulder. That's not a euphemism. So the parson gets to the village and inspects the school. He meets a bloke who looks identical to the limping bloke who went past him. He sees this spooky kid around and then sees the spooky kid again, and then hears through and I was going to say an email then. Obviously, it wouldn't be an email because, yeah, 18th. Here's from a letter that the Tom Sawyer kid, well, the Tom Sawyer kid is, his body is found in a drained lake. He's drowned. He's been the victim of a crime. Still got his hand round his rod, fishing rod. They realised that foul play was involved in murdering him. And yeah, he later hears by correspondence that they think it was the man who was his father who had beaten him for being stupid. Is that roughly, was that the one that you read?
That's roughly the one I read. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely along the same lines.
Yes. What did you think of it, Colin?
I really, really enjoyed it.
I thought it had got some strengths and some weaknesses. What did you like about it?
I liked some of the weaknesses, funny enough. I liked the spooky things that went on that were not explained, like the man with the limp at the start, because it was just an odd spooky thing to happen. But I liked at the point it happened. I liked the fact that we were reading this ghost story, and very quickly it gave us a ghostly thing to happen that made your brain start thinking, I'm reading a ghost story and I don't know where this is going. And on the weak side of things, what I really enjoyed was the amount of tangents it went off on. If and I think this will be discussed a bit more deeply, but when you actually analyze the story and what happens and why he's seeing the shadows, because it starts off with shadows, doesn't it, in the school?
Yeah.
And it's the schoolmaster, and I can't remember, was the schoolmaster the guy with the limp?
Well, yeah, that's one of the odd things. Yeah,
it wasn't the guy. It wasn't the schoolmaster. Was the guy with the limp? The guy with the limp was like this red herring of things, I thought. But the whole thing of seeing the kid and then seeing because he was going to give him a right good thrashing. You'll feel the weight of my cane, is what he said. When I find that boy who's leaving shadows around the place and listening in on our adult conversations. But then he would go off on these great tangents because that story sort of follows along, and then they find the squire of the area who owns all the mines, and the Drain Lake is to do with the mines, isn't it? Where they find the body, and sort of goes through there. But there's this whole swathe about the squire and about how he's got all this wealth and he goes around the world and he buys all this stuff, and is it actually worth anything if you're not doing anything with it? And that actually has nothing to do with the story at all. However, to me, it sounded like talking to a drunk parson. Because, when you sort of go back, I always remember when elderly relatives used to sit there and get drunk, they would tell a story that would go off all over the place before it got to the point.
Yeah.
And that's what this felt like. It actually felt like, for me, the character that at the beginning saying, I'm going to tell you this story about something that happened to me years ago. And it did feel like somebody telling you a story.
This is where we differ as people, because if you've got an elderly relative telling you a story and they're going from one point to another point to another point to another point with all these digressions, you are there enjoying the journey and enjoying the communication with them. Whereas me, if I've got an elderly relative that's telling me a story and he's going off on digressions, I'm thinking, up their fucking meds or something and get them back on what's actually happened. This one, it pissed me off a bit in that first scene where we've got the man who looks like the school teacher, who's got a limp, who walks past him, who disappears, and he's never referred to again. And
he is referred to once. He meets a guy, doesn't he? And that's why I'm saying that for some reason, and to be perfectly honest with you, I have literally finished reading this 2 hours ago, right? So there's obviously something not overly memorable about it. But when he gets to whatever it's called, the Scratchy Cat or whatever it is, where he's gone to, stay, and he meets a guy there that's identical to the guy with the limp, and then the guy says, "No, it can't be me," because
teacher.
And that is the school teacher.
Yeah.
Right. In which case, that's what it refers to. Then it does refer to it because he's the guy that killed the kid.
But it refers to the guy who looks like him, but he doesn't have a limp. And he
does that when he first meets him. He has a limp. That's the notable thing, because he actually says everything about him, including the limp, which was really pronounced, and that's right in the first time he meets him.
Oh, I must have missed that.
Yeah,
but yeah, with that, it doesn't explain why he was out there in the middle of this fucking field, how he disappeared.
Now this is where I thought it was quite interesting. However, as you know, I have a little bit of a bugbear with this kind of thing. It requires knowledge of ghost stories of that ilk to understand what that first part was. And if you don't have that particular thing which is effectively stone theory, the idea is that first meeting is when you realize at the end it's the guy that actually did the killing, is a reenactment of the boy dying and the person coming away from that. So the person is a ghost, but not a dead one. It's a reenactment it's the ghost showing the reenactment of what happened to them, effectively. It's going, this guy did it. But it's signpost very subtly in a kind of way that, no, you're not going to suss that out. And I have a bit of a bugbear about
that. I don't like that. I don't like the fact that I would need to have known this part about ghostly lore, according to Amelia Earhart, or whatever the fucking name is. And yeah, that just seems like irrelevant intertextuality and an establishment of a law that I've not agreed on. Law, LORE.
I will admit, see, I enjoyed the story, but this is where we get, remember, we always have this kind of thing. Did I enjoy it? Yes. Do I think it's a good example? No, I think it actually has huge amounts of flaws in it that stop it being a good example in that respect. And that's one of them. That's
Yeah,
the whole thing of I like the spookiness because when we read the Nanny's Tale,
yeah,
one of the complaints with that one is it didn't get into it. When the ghostly stuff started happening, it was bloody brilliant.
yeah,
But before that, when you had the realism going on, it went on a little bit long before getting there. So the pacing was a bit wrong. So
yes,
in this one, and it's really weird because as I was reading this one, I'm absolutely convinced I've read this before. Absolutely convinced. Didn't know it from the title, but I did say the Parson story reminded me of something.
yeah,
And all the way through it, I kept hearing paragraphs going, God, that sounds really familiar. And a lot of it is it's really, really like the Nanny story. It's like
yeah.
it in a lot of ways. But this one, it starts trying to be spooky earlier on than the Nanny story does.
Which, yeah, I appreciate it doing that because I
Mm,
think a spooky story, you want it to be spooky early on. You don't want to sort of like think, yep, this is what their normal lives are like. And
yeah.
yeah, yeah,
But I really was hoping that he'd get as far as the inn and everyone would ignore him and that actually he died on the car on the way there and that he was the ghost walking through the mist. Because when he does that person ignoring him, that's where my mind went instantly. I was thinking turning of the screw, at that point.
yeah, that would have definitely worked. Um, I thought some of the language that was used in it, and I appreciate it's not a recent story, but she was doing the thing where she negates things. So rather than saying, I can't remember specific examples off the top of my head, but rather than saying he was a tall man, she will say, and he was far from being a short man.
Yes.
And it's just, don't bullshit. Don't beat around the bush with this sort of like negative construction. Just sort of like go, tell me what he is. Don't tell me what he fucking
But a
isn't.
lot of that is the time. And I know we don't do this, it's because of the time, but that's just dialogue, isn't it?
Yeah.
Effectively. That kind of class of person. Because to be perfectly honest with you, I do stuff like that in stories and get away with it. Where there was a beautiful one she did about turning on a light, and it was just beautifully phrased. Instead of just going, they switched the light on. It was kind of like they spark into existence the illumination that enabled us to see around the room. It's and I have a soft spot for stuff like that if it's done well.
Yes, if it's done well, but
Yeah,
yeah, if it's a distraction or if it's sort of like overly done, in that case, yeah, it tends to piss me off.
I think maybe
Piss me off.
the
My pills, yeah.
I think maybe the story might have lost you a bit before that because he wasn't a short man. It is almost like a sarcastic answer, isn't it? Well, was he a tall man? Well, I just he wasn't a short man. It's that
Yeah.
kind of and you can imagine like the Parsons and the school people, and the jolly hockey sticks and the all that kind of Emily. I mean, I had sort of picture of her on the version that I've put on the reading list, for example. There's a little picture of her, and she is proper gentry.
Yeah.
I don't think she was a suffragette even. I think she didn't want the vote, and it's that's the way that she kind of looks in that kind of way, and you can imagine her using that kind of language.
With this story, we've got a one of the parts I did enjoy. This is going to make me sound like a horrible person, but I did enjoy the fact that we've got a murdered child in it.
Yes,
That because dead children in horror stories are incredibly spooky,
yes.
and justifiably so. So we've got a spooky dead child in there, but we've got a spooky dead child who was beaten to death for being stupid.
Well, beaten to death for being legitimately stupid.
Illegitimately stupid or illegitimate and stupid.
Well, I think it kind of rolls into one in a way because I didn't quite get the motivation of why the schoolmaster called him, because he was quite happily living with his grandma. Oh, that was it. He said he was saying maybe he just didn't want to spend any more money on him,
Right.
and all that kind of thing, wasn't it? And then he sort of like, and then basically it came down to the parson, not the parson, the schoolmaster.
Yep.
He was a very violent man and lost his temper completely. So, and then sort of rained down blows upon this child for being stupid, and then suddenly realised that he'd actually killed him. He'd done a bit of a Lenny on him.
Yeah.
So, I think that was, there was the end of it. I agree with you. I mean, dead kids, this is why Hocus Pocus, and I'm going to spoil it, right? Spoiler alert, Hocus Pocus 2 is shit. And one of the reasons it is.
Who would have thought that after watching Hocus Pocus 1?
I like Hocus Pocus.
Yeah.
But one of the reasons I like Hocus Pocus is because the witches are evil, nasty, and proper villains. And the reason that they're evil, nasty, and proper villains is because they kill kids.
Yeah.
Don't do that in Hocus Pocus 2. Completely softens it. And it's like this guy, one of the reasons he is a nasty piece of work, and you're quite happy for him to be trundled off towards whatever doom he is facing. Killed kid. It's one of the easiest. It's either kill a kid or, like we discussed the previous, kill an animal, kill a kid. You have now got yourself an instant villain that the reader can hate very, very quickly.
Yeah. Yeah, without a shadow of a doubt.
Yeah. And so, and that's kind of what was here. What I didn't like was the idea that, I was going to confess anyway, and then you caught me. That was a kind of like, I think that's where Chris Krimble got his ideas from for like Broadchurch or whatever. Because it was a little bit contrived towards the end of that side of things. But I love the whole discovery of the body, you see. I like the fact that there was this regular spookiness, this regular shadow. There was something going on that only the parson was seeing. There was something being hidden. He got the impression that the schoolmaster was hiding something, thought that was ace. I quite like the character of the squire being a bit of a show-off, and that's why they ended up going down that way. And I like the fact that there was this ghost story that had an ending because that's how they found the body, and so therefore it was like a communication from the dead and all that kind of stuff. And I did like the shadow in the prison at the end, that kept turning up to torture the guilty, which I thought those bits were great.
And I really thought it was effective the way the squire had been talking about how he owned all of the land around, and he owned all of the earth underneath and the mines, and he was like some sort of devil because he'd got all these figures working down below him.
That's right. He was the king of Hades, as he put it, wasn't he?
That tied in so nicely with the river sort of like suddenly disappearing as it filled up the mine shafts.
Yes.
Yeah, which is why that first ghost just pissed me off, because it was the first ghost of somebody who either wasn't a ghost or she'd forgotten about him. And I mean, I take what you're saying about this whole stone stuff, but it just seemed, because I'm out of the loop on that.
Oh, it's clunky. It's very clunky in that respect, because it's even me, who's sitting there justifying it to a certain degree, actually thought, well, what was the point of that? Because it doesn't refer back to it. Once it starts becoming the shadow, and it never refers, and like it says, it only ever talks about. I wasn't even sure if it was the schoolmaster that they were talking about with the limp, because it's so not referred back to. It's almost like it was written in and then forgotten about, like you were saying before.
Yeah, and also his limp. I mean, it says he has the limp, but in that first one, he's actually dragging his foot behind him, almost as though he's had his ankle broken.
Well, that's what I think. That was the idea was, as a like I say, it's clunky, isn't it? Because she's trying to do that. Identify, this is. It can't be anyone else. Is I think what's trying to state is when he sees this figure walking in the fog, right? And then meets someone who's identical in every way, in height and, everything, eye color, though you couldn't see it in the fog and all that kind of stuff. And it kind of says, but it couldn't have been anyone else because of the limp. And so it's a bit on the nose isn't it? It's a bit like the throwing something at a left-handed person because the murderer was left-handed, in the courtroom. It's a little bit on the nose.
Yes, yeah, it is definitely.
Yeah. And it is one of those, I mean, it's one of those, I enjoyed where it was going, and then it was a little bit afterwards when you think back at it to be annoyed by it. But that's I quite enjoyed the other stuff that was going on there. So that's why I say I really enjoyed it. Well, I wouldn't put it in the top 10, but I really enjoyed it.
I mean, there's only one reason it's getting in our top 100 at the moment.
That's because we've only done 52.
Yeah.
But it's not, it's one of those annoying pieces again, isn't it? Because it really isn't shit. This Emily actually has tremendous writing capabilities. Amelia.
Yeah.
She's not very good at writing her own name, though.
No, she's not. She keeps
it goes off all over the place. Yeah, she's Emily. She's sometimes Abigail. It's the writing is fantastic. I think the actual writing itself, the plot, and actually, I really like the character of the Parson. When we do that whole character thing, character plot, idea. I thought he was great. I thought he was, he was quite believable as this kind of bumbling parson that goes around doing these school inspections and being very Victorian kind of society fella.
Yeah, I thought the parson was believable. I thought the squire was believable. I thought the villain was a little bit two-dimensional.
Yeah, he was flat.
He went from being sort of like sycophantic towards anybody who's in a superior position to him, to beating kids to death with thick sticks.
Yeah, it needed a little bit more. We spent more time building the character of the squire than we spent building the character of the villain of the piece, without a doubt.
And no time building the character of the simple lad that got beaten to death.
No, but I mean, sometimes, he's literally a flat character.
Did he actually have a name?
I don't think he did, no.
No, which is
I missed that. Yeah, that's just knocked it down a couple of spots. I don't like unnamed characters in that respect.
No, I mean, it's like tends to diminish the whole thing that's an act. So the act of murdering the child has suddenly become something. It's the murder that's more important than the child's life.
Yes, and that does come across. Yeah. Actually, it is the act of, because that's why I said about I was feeling guilty and going to confess anyway. There's no sign of that. The only bit you've got is, he's a bit dodgy and he seems to know more about this than he's letting on. Now let's go and have a look at all the wonderful stuff this really rich guy has bought.
Yeah, who again is sort of like a waste on society. But
he's a good character. I thought he was a very good character, and I thought that was very well visualized. But I never, I forgot. I never picked up on that no name of the child, so that has just knocked it down a couple of points because it takes away the empathy.
Yeah, it does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, there was a wonderful Buffy episode where they did something similar, where a couple of kids were murdered, and all the local mothers got together to say how terrible this was. And then I think it was Angel that pointed out that nobody knew where these kids had come from. They'd not got any names. They were just sort of like, it does. It makes our upset at the death quite hollow.
Especially as it was such an imaginative way that he'd hidden the body with a fork. And I've never read that one before. I thought that was great. The idea of sort of like, you got this dead body and you want to keep it under the water. So you pierce it with a fork and then cut the handle off so it doesn't stick out the top of the water.
Yeah, that's pretty clever.
Yeah, I really like that. But I'm a bit annoyed now. Now you pointed that out. Yeah, should have named it. The child should have had a name.
Even if it was on a sort of like, I can't think of anything that's not incredibly offensive, so I won't say it.
It was from Cumbria, so I don't think you can offend people from Cumbria. I think they're unoffendable. They've got Carlisle, for God's sakes.
So yeah, it was an entertaining story. It got some. It was very well written. I can't argue with that.
Yeah.
The writing was superb and still stands up today as being very, very readable. It's just it's got some of the detrimental issues that that time period has with its writing.
Yes, and it does make the really good examples stand out. I think when you got things like that,
Yeah,
I will always go back to the open door. I thought that was amazing. And like I say, and it's amazing in parts, isn't it? Because I know we had a difference of opinion on the nurse's story,
yeah.
but the end of that, when the ghost stuff starts happening, it's just fabulous. The writing is great, and I find myself heavily influenced by the time period. But it's about picking it apart, isn't it? Because the majority of them seem to have these. Even M.R. James stories have these moments of where they just either soften or weaken, or you know, I even had that with the Edgar Allan Poe with that premature burial one. It's that it weakened towards the end. It's like a bit of a cop out sometimes.
And I think that's possibly down to the fact that we are in the 21st century looking back on these, and stories and narratives have been honed.
Yes,
And
yeah, absolutely.
become far more sophisticated. So the clunky parts are getting taken out and dropped.
Yeah, I mean, you could imagine because of the way a lot of these stories were consumed back then. They were fireside reads. There's something that I'm looking at the moment, which is the definition of the reader, and it's really interesting because who do you consider the reader to be, and then you start bringing in things like audiobooks, which is how we consume a lot of these stories.
Yeah.
Are we reading them or just listening to them? And in which point does it mean it's just the same as music, or is it a different form of entertainment? So I think the definition of the reader has to kind of change. So if somebody read out, and I mean, I've got this Halloween night coming up, as you know, where I'm going to read The Monkey's Paw to an audience, but the audience become the reader at that point. I think whoever's hearing the words becomes the reader. So when these things used to appear in like the Strand magazine, or whichever, some of them been in the Times and stuff, and they would be read by the fireside, as a family, and that would be one spooky tale to hear, for all its faults, because you wouldn't know the faults in it back then. So
does that mean that we're going to have a new interpretation of what the reader is, or does that mean that we're going to have to go back to an old interpretation of what the reader is?
Well, that's what I'm going to have a look at and see where that argument leads my mind to start with. I'm looking at it because of the sensory stuff that I've been looking at recently. I was telling you about the sensory storytelling.
Yeah.
And so that's stories that have to be consumed not by somebody picking up a book and reading it. The only way that the end user can really, experience it is because someone is going to tell them the story and then do the sensory side of things with them. So It's not a solo experience at all. So, but the person who's receiving all the sensory from that is the only person receiving the sensory in that particular performance of it. So they then really, I argue, would be considered the reader, not the person who's reading them the story, because only the one at the end is getting the full experience. So yeah, it's an interesting argument to have, in an interesting discussion to have. Is the reader the person who vocalizes, or is the reader the final person who gets the experience?
Would it be worth looking at the language they use for media studies when they talk about the encoder and the decoder?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, you're looking at, rather than being a reader, you're a decoder.
Yeah, I think that's where it comes in. But I think in language, I mean, I get the idea of the encoder and decoder, but I think to make it more accessible, we need to look at, I think it's a definition of the word reader and bringing those in together, because I think the word reader is something that people can understand better, and just redefining that, because everybody says it. If you're listening to an audiobook, you actually say, I'm reading.
Yeah.
So I think from a cognitive point of view, then really you want to try and keep a hold of it within where the cognitive language holds, the idea of words and the consumption of words. So, rather than just going decoding, which sounds more computer orientated and
Yeah.
It's very alien to the way that we think.
Do we think that when people were, if I was sitting on the settee and one of my relatives was sat by the fireside and they were reading a story from the Strand aloud, would I have called myself a reader of that story?
There's the interesting. Okay, let me try and swing it in a different way. When you were younger,
Yeah.
were you read books by your mother or father or uncle that wanted to get in your room or whatever?
I was just locked under the stairs waiting for
Waiting for a scholarship to a nice school.
Yeah, I suppose stories were read to me, but also I was an interactive participant in that. I would sort of like follow the things along the page, the words along the page as well.
Yeah, which isn't always there. But when you refer to them, because I always say, I mean, I know for example, when I was at school, our teacher read us Danny the Champion of the World.
Right.
And I've read it a couple of times myself since. So I've self-read since then. And group read. But I always refer to myself as the reader, even when I've just heard it. We're reading Danny the Champion of the World. You actually if somebody said to you, "What did you do last night?" you would say, "We read."
Yes.
From the Strand last night. We read that story from the Strand last night, rather than Mother read the story from the Strand last night and we all listened.
Yes. Yeah, I suppose. Yeah, we would take group ownership of it then, wouldn't we?
I think so, yeah.
And perhaps people did actually group read it because obviously 5,000 words of story for one person to try and read in one sitting, you'll be rasping by the end of it because yeah. So
yeah.
I would imagine they took turns, and yeah, it's your turn to have a go at it now.
Yeah, I mean that might have happened. I know sometimes they just used to have a reader, didn't they? They might read it over a couple of nights because it's like TV is for us now. The reason those periodicals were so popular is it made it into a bite size. Say most of Charles Dickens was released as an episodal thing rather than a full novel to start with. Yeah. But it did mean that you could read it either in one night or over a couple of nights and find those right places to read. And one of the older children might read some things and the parents would read other things. I think actually The Monkey's Paw almost starts a bit like that, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think it does.
See, the two of them are playing chess whilst the mother's reading a story.
Yeah.
So, it's
hearing you read this one, actually, yeah.
I'm looking forward to doing it. The only reason I know I can do it is because I've actually done, and I've done stand-up shows.
Yes.
Where you stand there and you talk for an hour.
Yes.
And it's not easy. It's taken a lot of practice to do it. So I'm looking forward to actually being able to actually just talk for about half an hour and have the words in front of me rather than trying to remember them for a change. That'll be good. And I'm also going to do, we're also going to do Edgar Allan Poe, that premature burial one. That's also going to be one of the stories that's read on the night. But I'm looking forward to playing with the equipment because that friend of mine's lent me that equipment and it's going to be quite fun. Yeah, I like stories. I don't believe any of it, but we'll see what happens on the night.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. So, what are we reading next week?
Next week, let me just look it up on here. We're going back to read some M.R. James.
Right.
I just felt it was right to read some M.R. James. Let's see if it comes up on here. Oh, my recommendations. No balls.
No balls. Is
No balls by M.R. James. No, hang on. Oh, I can't remember. I have a terrible name for that. M.R. James stories. I'll tell you which one it is in a second. Honestly, I'm not just picking a random M.R. James story here.
M.R. James and the No Balls. No balls.
M.R. James meets Hitler. There you go. A Warning to the Curious.
Oh. That one rings a bell. And we've not read this one before.
No.
A Warning to the Curious.
We have read from M.R. James before, The Mezzotint,
Yeah.
and the casting of the runes.
Right. So yeah, a warning to the curious. Brilliant. Well, that's actually kind of showing a lot of promise already because the mezzotint was a lot of fun.
Yes.
And the casting of the runes was a lot of fun as well.
Yes. And even though, I mean, we did have things to talk about it, that we thought the ends could have been a bit better. And like you say, and we've said it previously, standing on the shoulders of giants, we are 21st century. We have got so much more input and consumption that we've had from words than they had, which is amazing that they wrote those stories in the first place. So yeah, M.R. James, the master of the ghost story, I think, so let's return to him in this month of evil.
Damned right, yes. Warning to the curious. Thank you. Yeah, can't wait for that.
No problem at all. Well, that was I've really enjoyed that again tonight. Thank you so much for picking that story, Ash.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, really enjoyed it. And
brilliant.
Yeah, looking forward to the M.R. James.
Absolutely fantastic. Great. Well, see you next time then. All right.
Bye.
Bye.